October 15, 2023, Milwaukee County Courthouse, Courtroom 4A. Defense attorney Margaret Holloway had defended monsters for 28 years. But when prosecutor David Cain cracked his Jeffrey Dahmer joke, something in her chest went ice cold. The courtroom erupted in uncomfortable laughter. Cain smirked. Margaret's client, accused of 3 brutal murders, just stared at her with those dead eyes. Then Margaret did something no one expected. She smiled back, because in that moment she recognized Cain's voice, the same voice that had whispered to her dying brother 30 years ago in that basement. The same laugh she'd heard echoing through police recordings they said were corrupted beyond repair. The case everyone thought was about defending a killer? It was actually about catching one. The man who'd been prosecuting monsters was the biggest monster of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret's hands didn't shake as she gathered her files. 30 years of courtroom discipline held her steady even as her world tilted sideways. Around her, the gallery was still buzzing from Cain's joke, something about her client needing a recipe book instead of a lawyer, the kind of gallows humor that made prosecutors popular at bar association mixers. But Margaret heard something else entirely. That particular cadence, when Cain drawled tender meat, the way his tongue lingered on the T sound. She'd heard it before, muffled through basement floorboards, when she was 16 and Tommy was dying below. "Ms. Holloway?" Judge Brennan's voice cut through her revelation. "Your opening statement?" Margaret stood, her legs operating on autopilot. 28 years of muscle memory carried her to the lectern, while her mind raced backward through decades. Cain was watching her with those pale green eyes. How had she never noticed they were the exact shade of sea glass? The same eyes Tommy had described in his dying whisper, "Green like broken bottles, Maggie." "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady as granite, "we're here to determine the truth about James Morrison's alleged crimes. But I want you to remember something as we proceed. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones wearing suits." Cain's smirk faltered, just for a millisecond, but Margaret caught it. She'd been studying faces across courtrooms for 3 decades, learning to read the micro-expressions that revealed guilt, fear, calculation. What she saw in Cain's features now was recognition. He knew that she knew. The defendant, Morrison, was a pathetic creature. 24 years old, malnourished, with the hollow stare of someone who'd been broken long before he'd ever broken anyone else. The prosecution claimed he'd murdered 3 young men, dismembering them in his apartment bathroom. The methods were disturbingly familiar to anyone who remembered Milwaukee's darkest chapter in the 1990s. But as Margaret outlined her defense strategy, she found herself studying Cain instead of her notes. How long had he been in the DA's office? She tried to remember when she'd first encountered him. 5 years ago? 6? He'd appeared like a golden boy, Harvard-educated, with an impressive conviction rate and political ambitions everyone whispered about. "The state wants you to believe my client acted alone," Margaret continued, "that these crimes sprang from his damaged mind like some poisonous flower. But I submit to you that James Morrison is not the author of these horrors. He's a puppet. And somewhere in this city, the puppet master is watching." Cain objected. "Speculation, Your Honor." "Sustained," Judge Brennan ruled, but Margaret had accomplished what she intended. She'd fired the opening shot across Cain's bow, let him know this wouldn't be the straightforward conviction he'd expected. As the court recessed for lunch, Margaret packed her briefcase with methodical care. Her hands were steady now, her pulse controlled. She'd spent 30 years learning to channel rage into precision, grief into strategy. When Tommy died, she'd been a hysterical teenager screaming at detectives who treated her brother's murder like just another dead gay kid in a city full of them. Now she was a weapon forged by decades of courtroom warfare. Cain approached her table as the gallery emptied. "Interesting opening, counselor. Though I have to say, the conspiracy angle feels a bit desperate, even for you." Up close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and clean that couldn't quite mask an underlying scent she remembered from nightmares. Not quite antiseptic, not quite decay. The smell that had clung to Tommy's clothes when they'd found him. "Desperate times," Margaret replied, meeting his gaze directly. though I've always found that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. Something flickered behind Kane's eyes. Is that so? Oh yes. Take my brother's case, for instance. Tommy Holloway, murdered in 1993. The police said they lost the evidence, that the audio recordings were corrupted. Funny how that happens with inconvenient cases. Kane's smile never wavered, but Margaret saw his pupils dilate slightly. Fight-or-flight response. She'd touched a nerve. I'm sorry for your loss, he said smoothly. Though I'm not sure how a 30-year-old cold case relates to our friend Morrison here. Pattern recognition, Margaret said, snapping her briefcase closed. It's a skill you develop after defending monsters for as long as I have. You learn to spot the real predators hiding among the obvious ones. She walked past him toward the exit, then paused at the doorway. Oh, and David? That joke about Dahmer? In poor taste, even for a prosecutor. Some of us remember when this city was actually terrorized by a real monster. We don't find the comedy in it. Kane's response followed her into the hallway. Perhaps you should focus on the monster you're defending now, Margaret, rather than chasing ghosts. But Margaret was already 3 steps ahead, her mind cataloging every word, every inflection. The hunt she'd abandoned as a grieving teenager was about to begin again, and this time she knew exactly where to find her prey. The Milwaukee County Courthouse's marble corridors echoed with the hollow tap of Margaret's heels as she walked toward the exit, Kane's parting words still reverberating in her skull, chasing ghosts. The phrase felt deliberately chosen, weighted with meaning that went beyond casual dismissal. Outside, October wind cut through her wool coat, carrying the scent of Lake Michigan and dying leaves, the same wind that had blown 30 years ago when she'd identified Tommy's body at the morgue. She pulled her collar tighter and walked the 6 blocks to her office, muscle memory navigating while her mind dissected every moment of the courtroom exchange. Holloway and Associates occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated brewery, the kind of historically preserved building that Milwaukee used to paper over its grittier past. Margaret had chosen the location deliberately, close enough to the courthouse for convenience, far enough from the gleaming downtown firms to signal she wasn't playing their game. The brass nameplate still read in Associates, though she'd worked alone for the past 5 years. Hope died hard, even for someone who made her living defending the damned. How'd it go? Elena Vasquez looked up from her desk as Margaret entered, dark eyes already reading the tension in her boss's shoulders. Elena had been Margaret's investigator for 8 years, a former Milwaukee PD detective who'd left the force after one too many cases that mysteriously went cold. She understood the unspoken rules of the city's justice system, which made her invaluable. Kane made a joke about Dahmer, Margaret said, hanging her coat on the antique oak rack that had belonged to her father. Said Morrison should have asked for a recipe book instead of a lawyer. Elena's expression darkened. She'd grown up in Milwaukee during the Dahmer years, remembered the fear that had gripped the city. Tasteless, even for a prosecutor. You think he was testing you? Margaret settled into her chair, the familiar creak of old leather offering a moment's comfort. Through her window, she could see the spires of the cathedral where she and Tommy had attended Mass as children, back when she still believed in divine justice. He knows about Tommy. How can you be sure? The way he reacted when I mentioned the case. Most people hear about a 30-year-old murder, they express sympathy and move on. Kane's pupils dilated. Classic stress response. Margaret opened her desk drawer, fingers finding the small silver frame she kept hidden there. Tommy at 18 grinning in his graduation photo, 3 months before he died. Plus the cologne. Elena leaned forward. You smelled something? Bergamot and cedar, expensive stuff. But underneath, Margaret's voice trailed off as she traced Tommy's face through the glass. The night they found him, when I identified the body, there was this smell on his clothes. The medical examiner said it was just disinfectant mixed with decomposition, but it was more specific than that. Medicinal, but wrong somehow. Margaret, Elena's voice carried warning. You know how dangerous this thinking gets. We've been down this road before. They had. 5 years ago, Margaret had convinced herself that a different prosecutor showed signs of recognition when she mentioned Tommy's case. She'd spent months building a conspiracy that existed only in her grief-addled imagination, nearly destroying her practice in the process. Elena had been the one to pull her back from the brink, forcing her to confront the difference between pattern recognition and paranoid obsession. But this felt different. Kane's reaction hadn't been the polite discomfort of someone hearing about an old tragedy. It was the startled alertness of a predator realizing he'd been spotted. Margaret's phone buzzed. Text message from her nephew Jake. Dinner Sunday? Sarah wants to show you her new painting. The message grounded her instantly. Jake was Tommy's son, born 6 months after the murder to a girlfriend who disappeared before anyone knew she was pregnant. Margaret had found them 3 years later, living in a shelter in Chicago. She'd spent the next 2 decades helping Jake build a life, watching him grow into the kind of man Tommy would have been proud of. Now Jake was 32, married, with a 7-year-old daughter who called Margaret Aunt Maggie, and painted portraits of unicorns with fierce determination. "I'll bring dessert," Margaret typed back. "Tell Sarah I want to see everything." These were the stakes Kane couldn't know about. Not just Margaret's obsession with solving Tommy's murder, but the family she'd built from its ashes. Jake had inherited his father's gentle nature. Sarah had Tommy's artistic eye, and they represented everything Margaret had to protect. "Run a background check on David Kane," she told Elena, slipping the photo back into the drawer. Education, employment history, where he was living in 1993. Everything. Elena nodded, already reaching for her laptop. "What about Morrison's case? We'll build his defense properly. But if Kane thinks he can play games with me, he's about to learn what 30 years of rage looks like when it finally finds a target." Outside, storm clouds gathered over the lake, and Margaret felt the familiar electric tension that preceded a good hunt. The package arrived Tuesday morning. Margaret was reviewing Morrison's psychiatric evaluations when Elena knocked on her office door, holding a manila envelope with the careful distance of someone who'd learned not to trust unexpected deliveries. "No return address," Elena said, setting it on Margaret's desk. Hand-delivered to the lobby around 7 a.m. Security cameras caught a figure in a hoodie, but no clear face shot. Margaret stared at the envelope. Her name was written across the front in block letters, the kind of careful, anonymous script that belonged to ransom notes and manifesto drafts. After 30 years of defending criminals, she'd learned to recognize the handwriting of the guilty. This had that same deliberate quality, each letter formed to reveal nothing. "Could be related to Morrison's case," Elena suggested, but her voice carried doubt. Margaret pulled on latex gloves before opening the envelope. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, grainy with age. Her breath caught in her throat. Tommy. Alive. Standing outside the Riverside Theater downtown, laughing at something off camera. He wore the green flannel shirt she'd given him for his 19th birthday, the one the police had said was too damaged to return to the family. But here it was, clean and whole, and Tommy was beautiful in the way only the dead could be in photographs, frozen at his best moment, unmarked by what was coming. Margaret's hands began to shake. She'd never seen this picture before. She had every photograph of Tommy that existed, had collected them obsessively from friends and family after his death, building a shrine to a life cut short. This image didn't belong to her collection, which meant someone else had been watching her brother. Someone who'd been close enough to capture this candid moment. She flipped the photograph over. More block letters. He trusted the wrong person. "Just like you're doing now, Margaret?" Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. "What is it?" Margaret couldn't speak. The photograph was time-stamped, October 15th, 1993, 3 days before Tommy died, 3 days before someone had lured him to that basement on the north side and beaten him to death with a hammer. The police had never determined how Tommy had ended up in that location, miles from anywhere he'd normally go. They'd assumed he'd been cruising, that he'd picked up the wrong stranger. But this photograph suggested something else entirely. Premeditation, surveillance. A hunter who'd studied his prey before striking. Margaret's mind raced through the implications. Someone had been following Tommy, documenting his movements, his routines. Someone who'd kept this photograph for 30 years and chosen this moment, right after her confrontation with Kane, to reveal it. "Margaret, you're scaring me." Elena moved around the desk, reaching for the photograph. "Don't touch it," Margaret snapped, her voice sharper than intended. She forced herself to breathe, to think like the lawyer she'd trained herself to be, rather than the grieving sister who still lived inside her chest. Fingerprints, DNA. This is evidence. Evidence of what, though? That Tommy had been stalked before his murder? That someone had saved a trophy from their surveillance? Or that 30 years later, someone wanted Margaret to know they'd been watching then, and were still watching now? Her phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, local area code. Margaret hesitated, then answered. Holloway. Silence, then breathing, deliberate and measured. I know you remember me, a voice said. Male, middle-aged, with the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. Not Kane. This voice was rougher, older. I know you've been looking for me all these years. Who is this? Someone who knew your brother very well. Someone who's been waiting for you to get close enough to the truth to matter. Margaret's free hand gripped the edge of her desk. Are you? I'm the man who killed Tommy Holloway. And Margaret, you're even prettier than he said you'd be. The line went dead. Margaret stared at the phone, her entire worldview reshaping itself around this moment. For 30 years, she'd carried Tommy's murder like a stone in her chest, the weight of unsolved grief that had driven every decision, every case, every sleepless night. She'd built theories and abandoned them, suspected strangers and ruled out possibilities, always circling back to the fundamental question, why Tommy? Now she had her answer. Tommy hadn't been a random victim. He'd been chosen because of her, because someone had wanted to hurt Margaret Holloway, and the best way to destroy her was to kill the person she loved most. Elena was saying something, reaching for the phone to call the police, but Margaret barely heard her. She was remembering Kane's smile in the courtroom, the way he'd said her name like he'd been practicing it, the cologne that had triggered buried memories, the timing of Morrison's case, assigned to her just weeks after she'd started making noise about reopening Tommy's investigation. 30 years of cat and mouse, and she'd never realized she was the mouse. Margaret's first instinct was to run. Not physically, she'd stopped running from difficult truths decades ago, but to retreat into the familiar routines that had kept her sane for 30 years. File the photograph as evidence, report the phone call to police, focus on Morrison's case and let sleeping monsters lie. We need to call Detective Morrison, Elena said, reaching for her cell phone. This is a direct threat. No. Margaret's voice came out hoarse. She cleared her throat, tried again. No police. Not yet. Elena stared at her. Margaret, someone just confessed to murder. Your brother's murder. And said what, exactly? That he killed Tommy? With what proof? Anonymous phone calls and old photographs don't constitute evidence. Margaret stood, pacing to the window. Her reflection looked pale against the gray October sky. Any halfway decent prosecutor would dismiss this as harassment from a Morrison case crank. You don't believe that. Margaret didn't. But 30 years of legal training warred with 30 years of grief-fueled obsession, and training usually won. It had to. The moment she let emotion drive her decisions was the moment she became useless to her clients and dangerous to herself. Her phone buzzed. Text message from Jake, everything okay? You missed Sarah's recital call last night. Guilt hit her like cold water. She'd forgotten. 7-year-old Sarah had called to sing the song she'd learned at school, a Tuesday tradition Margaret never missed. But she'd been staring at crime scene photos from Morrison's case, looking for connections that might not exist. Sorry, sweetheart. Can I make it up with ice cream this weekend? Sarah says only if it's chocolate chip cookie dough. Margaret smiled despite everything. Sarah's negotiations would serve her well in whatever career she chose. The thought of her niece growing up in a world where Tommy's killer walked free made her stomach clench. Run Kane's background anyway, she told Elena, quietly. And I want to know everyone who had access to Tommy's case files. Elena nodded, but Margaret caught her exchanging a look with someone behind her. Margaret turned to find Dr. Patricia Welch standing in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, expression carefully neutral. Patricia had been Margaret's court-appointed therapist 15 years ago, after a particularly brutal case had sent Margaret spiraling into the kind of breakdown that made headlines. Now she was a friend, one of the few people who understood the weight Margaret carried. Elena called, Patricia said simply, "Mind if I sit?" Margaret wanted to refuse, But Patricia was already settling into the client chair with the stubborn grace of someone who'd spent decades dealing with resistant patients. She was 63, silver-haired, with the kind of calm authority that made judges listen when she testified about psychological evaluations. "You're not my therapist anymore, Pat." "No. I'm your friend, and friends don't let friends chase ghosts alone." Patricia's voice carried no judgment, only concern. "Elena told me about the photograph." Margaret felt the walls closing in. This was how it started. Well-meaning people gathering around her like she was fragile, like she couldn't handle the truth about her own brother's death. It had happened before, after her last obsession with Tommy's case had nearly destroyed her practice. "I'm not having a breakdown," Margaret said firmly. "I know, but you're also not thinking clearly." Patricia leaned forward. "Margaret, I've known you for 15 years. I've watched you build an extraordinary career defending people everyone else had written off. But Tommy's case is your blind spot. It always has been. Someone confessed. Someone claimed responsibility. There's a difference. How many false confessions have you seen in your career? How many attention seekers and fantasists who insert themselves into famous cases?" Margaret wanted to argue, but Patricia's logic was sound. She'd represented 3 different men who'd confessed to murders they couldn't possibly have committed, usually for the notoriety or because they were covering for someone else. But the photograph, the timing, Kane's reaction in the courtroom. "I need coffee," Margaret announced, grabbing her purse. Real coffee, not the swill Elena makes. She was halfway to the door when Patricia's voice stopped her. "Margaret, be careful who you trust right now." Something in the older woman's tone made Margaret pause. Patricia was watching her with an intensity that seemed almost fearful. "Pat, just be careful. Some stones are better left unturned." Margaret stared at her friend, searching for the meaning behind the cryptic warning. But Patricia had already turned away, suddenly fascinated by her coffee cup. Outside, Margaret walked the familiar route to Anodyne Coffee, muscle memory navigating while her mind reeled. Patricia's reaction bothered her more than she wanted to admit. In 15 years, she'd never seen the woman show fear. Her phone rang again. Unknown number. This time, Margaret let it go to voicemail. She was learning that some questions were more dangerous than others. The coffee shop was nearly empty at mid-morning, just Margaret and a handful of freelancers tapping away at laptops. She ordered a double espresso and claimed a corner table, checking her phone. 1 missed call, no voicemail. Whoever had called Tommy's killer earlier wasn't ready to talk again. Margaret pulled up the voicemail from the unknown number anyway, pressing the phone to her ear. Static, then breathing. Then, "You can't hide behind your reputation forever, Margaret. Some debts come due eventually." Different voice, younger. And something in the cadence made her skin crawl with recognition she couldn't place. She was about to replay it when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Jake's name on the screen. "Hey," she answered, grateful for the lifeline. "Aunt Maggie, we have a problem." Jake's voice carried the careful control he'd inherited from Tommy, steady in crisis, which meant the crisis was real. "Someone came by the house this morning. Asked Sarah about you." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "What kind of someone?" "Middle-aged guy. Said he was a reporter writing about defense attorneys. Wanted to know about our family history, about Uncle Tommy. Sarah told him you were the best lawyer in Milwaukee, and that Uncle Tommy was in heaven watching over us. 7-year-old logic, innocent and devastating." Margaret closed her eyes. "Where were you?" "At work. The neighbor called me when she saw a strange man talking to Sarah at the bus stop. By the time I got home, he was gone." Jake's voice cracked slightly. "Margaret, Sarah doesn't know about how Tommy died. She thinks it was a car accident. I didn't want—" "You did right." Margaret was already standing, leaving her untouched espresso on the table. "Jake, I need you to pick Sarah up from school today. Don't let her walk home alone. Don't let her talk to strangers. Can you do that?" "Of course. But Margaret, what's going on? This isn't about some old case, is it?" She wanted to lie, to give him the same careful non-answers she'd been providing for 30 years. But someone had approached his 7-year-old daughter. Someone knew where Jake lived, where Sarah went to school, the routes she took through their neighborhood. "It might be connected to Tommy's case," she admitted. "I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to be extra careful. Both of you." Silence. Then, "Are you finally going to tell me what really happened to my father?" The question she'd been dreading for 30 years. Jake had been 6 months old when Tommy died, raised on carefully constructed stories about a father who'd loved him desperately but died too young. Margaret had built an entire mythology around Tommy's memory, the artist, the dreamer, the gentle soul who would have been the perfect father if the world hadn't stolen him away. She'd never mentioned the basement, the hammer, the way Tommy's body had been arranged like a display, like someone's sick idea of art. "Not over the phone," Margaret said finally. "Come by my office tonight after Sarah's asleep. Bring the photo albums." After Jake hung up, Margaret stood on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, watching ordinary people live ordinary lives. A young mother pushed a stroller past the bus stop where someone had questioned her niece. An elderly man fed pigeons near the bench where Margaret had once sat with Tommy, planning his future that would never come. The weight of 30 years of silence pressed against her chest. All the lies she'd told, all the truths she'd buried, all the ways she'd failed the people she loved most. Her phone rang. "Elena." "Margaret, you need to get back here. Now." "What's wrong?" "David Kane is here. He wants to discuss Morrison's case, but Margaret," Elena's voice dropped to a whisper, "he brought flowers. Said he heard you'd received some disturbing communications and wanted to express his concern." Margaret felt the world tilt sideways. Kane couldn't know about the photograph or the phone calls unless he was involved, unless this had all been orchestrated from the beginning. "Don't let him into my office," Margaret said, already walking fast toward her car. "Keep him in the reception area. Tell him I'll be right back. Margaret, he knows things. About your brother's case. Details that weren't in the newspapers." The parking meter next to Margaret's car had expired, a bright orange ticket fluttering under the windshield wiper. She grabbed it absently, her mind racing. Kane had come to her office bearing flowers and sympathy, playing the concerned colleague while demonstrating exactly how much he knew about her private hell. 30 years of cat and mouse, and the mouse was finally beginning to understand the rules of the game. She drove toward her office through streets that suddenly felt foreign, past buildings that might be hiding watchers, toward a confrontation that had been 3 decades in the making. Behind her, in the rearview mirror, a black sedan maintained perfect distance. The hunt, it seemed, was no longer one-sided. Margaret drove toward her office with hypernatural awareness, every traffic light a potential trap, every pedestrian a possible threat. The black sedan had disappeared 3 blocks back, but that meant nothing. After 30 years of thinking she was hunting the truth, she was learning how thoroughly she'd been hunted instead. She pulled into the parking garage beneath her building, scanning the shadows between concrete pillars. Her footsteps echoed off bare walls as she walked toward the elevator, each sound amplified in the underground silence. On the 7th floor, Elena buzzed her through the security door with obvious relief. "He's been waiting 20 minutes, Elena whispered, nodding toward the reception area. "Keep asking about your family, your background. Says he's always admired your dedication to lost causes." Through the glass partition, Margaret could see Kane's profile as he examined the framed photos on Elena's desk. He held a small bouquet of yellow roses, funeral flowers, she realized with sick clarity. The kind you brought to express sympathy for the dead. Margaret straightened her shoulders and walked into the reception area, with the confident stride that had intimidated prosecutors for decades. "David, this is unexpected." Kane turned, and his smile was different now. Less performance, more genuine pleasure, like a mask slipping just enough to reveal the face underneath. "Margaret, I was concerned about you after court yesterday. You seemed affected by the Morrison case. I'm fine, though I'm curious how you heard about any communications I might have received. Milwaukee's legal community is small. Word travels." Kane's eyes were pale gray, almost colorless. Margaret wondered how she'd never noticed that before. "I brought these for your office. Yellow roses. They represent remembrance, don't they?" The casual cruelty of it stole Margaret's breath. Yellow roses for remembrance, brought by a man who somehow knew intimate details about her brother's unsolved murder. She accepted the flowers with steady hands, though her pulse hammered against her throat. That's very thoughtful. Though I'm surprised you had time, given how busy you must be with Morrison's case. Kane stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne again. That familiar scent she still couldn't place, mixing with something else now, the metallic tang of excitement, like blood in the air. Oh, Morrison, Kane waved dismissively. Open and shut case, really, though I have to admit, watching you work is fascinating. The way you pour yourself into defending the indefensible, like each client is a personal mission, very noble. Someone has to stand between the accused and the state's unlimited resources. Even when they're guilty? Margaret met his eyes steadily. Everyone deserves representation, even monsters. Kane's laugh was soft, almost intimate. Monsters. Yes, I suppose that's what we call them when we don't understand their motivations. But what if their motivations are perfectly clear? What if they're not random acts of violence, but carefully planned, artistic statements? The word artistic hit Margaret like a physical blow. She'd never told anyone about the crime scene photos from Tommy's case, about the way his body had been arranged like a grotesque tableau. That detail had been held back from the press, known only to investigators, and I should get back to work, Margaret said, her voice barely steady. Of course. But Margaret? Kane reached out and touched her arm, his fingers cold even through her jacket sleeve. I want you to know that I understand loss. I know what it's like to lose someone precious, someone irreplaceable. The sympathy in his voice sounded absolutely genuine, which made it more horrifying than any threat. Margaret pulled away. Thank you for the flowers. Kane nodded and walked toward the elevator, but paused at the security door. Oh, and Margaret, that photograph you received today, the one of your brother outside the Riverside Theater? I always thought that was one of his better angles. The elevator doors closed before Margaret could respond. She stood frozen in her reception area, the yellow roses clutched in her hands like evidence. Elena was staring at her with wide eyes, but Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. Kane knew about the photograph. Kane had just implied he'd taken the photograph. David Kane, Milwaukee County Prosecutor. The man who'd made cruel jokes about Jeffrey Dahmer in open court. The man who'd been prosecuting criminals while Margaret defended them for over a decade. Margaret's mind raced backward through years of cases, searching for the pattern she'd missed. How many times had Kane been assigned to prosecute her clients? How many times had he seemed to know just a little too much about her defense strategy? How many times had he watched her work with that same appreciative smile she'd thought was professional respect? The yellow roses tumbled from her nerveless fingers, scattering across Elena's desk like small suns, like evidence of a game that had been playing out under her nose for 30 years. Margaret? Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. What just happened? Margaret finally understood Patricia's warning. Some stones were better left unturned because what lived underneath them had been waiting patiently in the dark, growing stronger while you convinced yourself you were safe. Margaret's legs gave out first. She collapsed into the nearest chair, her breathing shallow and rapid. Elena rushed to her side, but Margaret held up a trembling hand. Get me everything, Margaret whispered. Every case Kane prosecuted against me. Every time we faced each other in court. Go back 15 years. Elena hesitated. Margaret, should I call Patricia or Jake? No. The word came out sharp as glass. Margaret forced herself to stand, muscle memory overriding shock. 30 years of courtroom composure couldn't fail her now. Nobody else gets involved. Not yet. But even as she spoke, Margaret knew it was too late. Jake was already involved. Someone had approached Sarah. Patricia was involved. That warning hadn't been casual concern. How many people around her had been pieces in Kane's game without knowing it? Margaret walked into her office and locked the door behind her. The familiar space felt contaminated now, every photograph and diploma a potential prop in some elaborate stage production. She pulled out her phone and called the number that had reached Tommy's killer. It rang twice before connecting. I wondered when you'd call back. Kane's voice was warm, almost fond, though I thought the roses were a nice touch. Yellow suits you. It brings out the grief in your eyes. Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. What do you want? Want? Oh, Margaret, this isn't about wanting. This is about completion, about seeing a 30-year project through to its proper conclusion. Tommy was a project to you? Kane's laugh carried genuine delight. Tommy was the overture. Brilliant, passionate, naive Tommy, who thought he could expose corruption in the mayor's office with nothing but righteous indignation and a camera. He had no idea he was photographing the wrong crime. Margaret's blood turned to ice water. What crime? The real estate deals, of course. All those condemned buildings downtown that somehow got rezoned for development? Tommy thought he'd stumbled onto a bribery scandal. He didn't realize he'd documented something much more personal, much more dangerous. The basement, the construction equipment, the way Tommy's body had been arranged among paint cans and drop cloths like he belonged there, like he was part of the renovation. You killed him to cover up a real estate scheme? I killed him because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, seeing things that would have complicated my plans. But Margaret, Kane's voice dropped to something almost tender. I kept watching you afterward, the way you threw yourself into law school, into defending the broken and discarded, the way you turned Tommy's death into this beautiful, terrible purpose. I couldn't just walk away from that kind of artistry. Margaret thought of all the cases over the years, all the times Kane had seemed to anticipate her moves, know her strategies before she played them. You've been controlling my career, guiding it, providing worthy adversaries. Some of my best work has been done in courtrooms with you, Margaret. The Morrison case was meant to be our finale, a Jeffrey Dahmer copycat for the sister of a murder victim, prosecuted by the original killer. Perfect symmetry. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. 30 years of her life choreographed by the man who'd destroyed her family, every client she'd defended potentially hand-selected by her brother's killer. But something went wrong, Margaret said, pieces clicking into place. Morrison's confession didn't go as planned. Morrison got greedy, started claiming responsibility for crimes he didn't commit, including Tommy's death. I couldn't allow that. It would have ruined the reveal. Some stories require proper timing. Outside Margaret's office window, Milwaukee stretched toward Lake Michigan under gray October sky. Ordinary people living ordinary lives in a city where justice was supposed to mean something, where prosecutors were supposed to seek truth, not orchestrate elaborate revenge fantasies spanning decades. The game ends now, Margaret said. Does it? Who would believe you? A decorated prosecutor versus a defense attorney with a history of obsessing over her brother's cold case? You suffered a breakdown 15 years ago, Margaret. Public record, and now you're claiming the prosecutor handling your current case is actually a serial killer who's been manipulating your career for 3 decades? Kane's voice carried amused sympathy. Even your friend Patricia would have you committed. Patricia. Margaret remembered that moment of fear in her friend's eyes, the cryptic warning about leaving stones unturned. Did Patricia know? Had she always known? Besides, Kane continued, I genuinely care about you, about your work. Do you know how rare it is to find someone who understands the artistry involved in this kind of long-term project? Most people lack the vision. Margaret ended the call and sat in the gathering darkness of her office. Outside, streetlights were beginning to flicker on. Elena had gone home. The building settled into evening quiet around her. For 30 years, she'd believed she was seeking justice for Tommy. Now she understood she'd been performing in someone else's twisted theater, every case a scene in a play whose ending had been written before she'd even learned her lines. But Kane had made one crucial error. He'd assumed that learning the truth would break her. Instead, it was setting her free. Margaret sat motionless in the darkened office, the weight of 30 years pressing against her chest. But where she expected to find devastation, she discovered something else entirely: clarity. Pure, crystalline understanding that cut through decades of confusion like light through fog. Kane's fatal flaw wasn't his cruelty. It was his need to be appreciated for it. She opened her desk drawer and retrieved the digital recorder she used for client interviews. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she checked the battery, tested the audio levels. Then she called Kane back. I've been thinking about what you said, she began, her voice carrying the exact note of weary defeat he would expect. About artistry, about vision. Kane's pleasure was audible. I knew you'd understand eventually. You always were the smartest person in any room. Walk me through it. From the beginning. I need to know how completely I've been played." For the next hour, Kane obliged her with the thoroughness of an artist unveiling his masterpiece. He detailed the real estate scheme Tommy had unknowingly photographed, buildings purchased through shell companies, their development contracts awarded to Kane's associates. He described following Tommy to the basement that night, the moment of decision when silence became more valuable than a young man's life. The hammer was there already, Kane explained with clinical detachment. Construction materials everywhere. It was almost too perfect, like the universe was providing stage direction. Margaret's grip on the phone tightened, but her voice remained steady. "And afterward? When did you start watching me?" "Immediately. I attended Tommy's funeral, back row, respectfully dressed. Watching you grieve was educational. I'd never seen raw grief transmuted into pure purpose before. When you enrolled in law school, I knew I had to see where that transformation led." Kane had pulled strings to ensure Margaret's early career brought her into his orbit. He'd influenced case assignments, recommended her for certain clients, even arranged for her breakdown 15 years ago when her investigation into Tommy's murder had gotten too close to the truth. "That was my only miscalculation," Kane admitted. "I pushed too hard too fast. You weren't ready for the revelation then. But now, after Morrison, the timing is perfect. Morrison was never random, was he? My greatest creation. Lonely, suggestible, desperate for guidance. It took months to shape his fantasies, plant the right images in his mind. Jeffrey Dahmer was simply the template. Everyone understands that particular brand of horror. Margaret felt sick, understanding wash over her. You created a killer. I inspired one. There's a difference. Though I admit, Morrison exceeded even my expectations. The ritualistic elements, the way he arranged his victims, almost artistic. You should be proud." "Proud?" "He was inspired by your work, Margaret, by the passion you bring to defending the supposedly indefensible. In a way, Morrison was our collaboration." The monstrous ego of it stole Margaret's breath. Kane had murdered her brother, manipulated her career, created a killer, all so he could reveal himself as the puppet master pulling her strings. He wanted appreciation. He wanted her to acknowledge his twisted genius. Margaret thought of Sarah, 7 years old and innocent, approached by a stranger who knew family secrets. Tommy, 26 and idealistic, dying alone in a basement because he'd stumbled onto the wrong truth. All the clients she'd defended over the years, wondering now which ones Kane had specifically chosen for her, which tragedies he'd orchestrated. "There's just one thing I don't understand," Margaret said carefully. "Ask me anything. Why reveal it now? Why not let the game continue?" Kane's pause lasted just a beat too long. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different note, something almost vulnerable. "Because I'm dying, Margaret. Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe less, and I couldn't let this masterpiece end without the proper audience understanding what they'd witnessed." There it was, the human weakness beneath the monster's facade. Kane needed her to recognize his genius before death claimed him. He needed validation for 30 years of calculated cruelty. Margaret closed her eyes and thought of Tommy's laugh, bright and infectious, of Jake's voice on the phone, asking if he'd finally learned the truth about his father, of Sarah at a bus stop, trusting a stranger because she'd been taught to trust authority figures. "David," she said softly, "there's something you should know." "What's that?" "I've been recording this conversation." Silence stretched between them, electric with sudden tension. "Mand," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength with each word, "I called the FBI 2 hours ago. They're very interested in cold cases involving prosecutors with access to evidence files, especially when those prosecutors demonstrate intimate knowledge of crime scene details that were never made public." Kane's breathing changed, becoming sharper. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" "You wanted an audience for your masterpiece, David. Congratulations. You're going to have one." The line went dead. Margaret sat in her office, the recorder still running, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 30 years, the absolute certainty that justice was finally coming. Margaret remained in her chair long after the phone line went dead, the recorder's red light still blinking in the darkness of her office. Outside, Milwaukee settled into its familiar evening rhythm, traffic thinning, office windows going dark one by one, the city breathing out the day's tension. She had imagined this moment countless times over 30 years, the moment when Tommy's killer would finally be identified. She had expected rage or vindication or the fierce satisfaction of justice delayed but not denied. Instead, she felt something unexpected, grief, not for Tommy. That grief had been her constant companion for decades, worn smooth by time like a stone in her pocket. This was grief for the life she might have lived, for the choices that had been hers instead of moves in someone else's elaborate game. The FBI arrived within an hour. Margaret watched from her window as unmarked cars pulled up to Kane's downtown condo, their headlights cutting through the October night. Agent Patricia Reeves, no relation to her friend Patricia, just another of life's small ironies, was a woman about Margaret's age with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. "The recording is compelling," Agent Reeves said, reviewing Margaret's statement in the conference room down the hall. "Combined with the physical evidence from your brother's case and Kane's access to sealed files, we have enough for an arrest warrant." Margaret nodded, exhaustion settling into her bones like sediment. "What about Morrison? His confession is being re-evaluated. If Kane shaped his actions the way the recording suggests, Morrison's case becomes significantly more complex." More complex. Margaret almost smiled at the euphemism. Morrison was still a killer, still responsible for taking lives, but he was also a victim of Kane's manipulation. The neat categories of guilt and innocence that had structured Margaret's career for 3 decades suddenly felt inadequate. Kane was arrested at home 3 days later. Margaret learned about it from the morning news, watching his perp walk from her kitchen while coffee grew cold in her hands. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his courtroom authority, just a dying man who had spent 30 years orchestrating cruelty and calling it art. The trial, when it came, was anticlimactic. Kane's cancer moved faster than the legal system, and by the time jury selection began, he was clearly weakening. He maintained his innocence publicly but never recanted his recorded confession. His attorney, a competent if uninspired public defender, mounted a defense based on terminal illness and prosecutorial stress, painting Kane as a man who had fabricated elaborate fantasies to cope with his diagnosis. Margaret attended every day of testimony, sitting in the gallery's front row where Kane could see her. She wanted him to understand that his audience was no longer impressed, no longer manipulated. She was simply bearing witness to the end of a story that had consumed too much of her life. Jake flew in from Denver for the verdict. He sat beside Margaret in the courthouse, holding her hand the way Tommy used to during thunderstorms when they were children. Guilty on all counts. Kane showed no emotion as the verdict was read, but his eyes found Margaret's across the courtroom. She saw confusion there, and something that might have been disappointment. Even at the end, he couldn't understand why she wasn't grateful for the elaborate performance he had created around her grief. Kane died in the prison medical ward 6 weeks later, pancreatic cancer claiming him before the appeals process could begin. Margaret felt nothing when Patricia, her friend Patricia, not the FBI agent, called with the news. The absence of feeling was itself a kind of peace. The memorial service for Tommy that Margaret organized that spring was small and private. Jake brought Sarah, who was old enough now to understand that her grandfather had been taken from them by someone who mistook cruelty for cleverness. They planted a yellow rose bush in Riverside Park, not far from where Tommy used to photograph the lake at sunset. "Do you think he would have liked being a grandfather?" Sarah asked, her small fingers gentle on the newly planted thorns. "He would have loved it," Margaret said, and for the first time in 30 years, thinking about Tommy brought only warmth, not pain. Margaret retired from criminal defense the following year. She opened a small practice focused on estate planning and family law, quiet work that helped ordinary people protect what they loved instead of defending the indefensible. The change felt like taking off clothes that had never quite fit properly. She kept the office in the same building, though she redecorated completely. The yellow roses in her window box bloomed faithfully each spring, no longer symbols of remembrance, but simple beauty marking the passage of seasons. Sometimes she would catch herself looking toward the prosecutor's office across the street and remember the weight of carrying someone else's secret for so long without knowing it. Justice, Margaret had learned, was not always the restoration she had imagined. Sometimes it was simply the end of a story that had gone on too long.